Welcome, everyone. Brain and neurocognitive system health is not something talked about as freely as science-based as with the heart and the cardiovascular system, the lungs and the respiratory system health, the musculoskeletal system health, etc. That needs to change. As the body's master system over all other bodily systems, knowledge with understanding and application of brain and neurocognitive system health is vital for a proactive, holistic approach to individual and public health, well-being, and safety and sustainability. We are really privileged and honored to have three presenters here tonight on this subject from three different perspectives: education, science, and research. And they are going to orient us into this subject. And hopefully we'll leave here with being able to have some ideas as how can we integrate understanding of the neuroscience of brain and neurocognitive system health to improve community and public health. So thank you all for attending. This is going to be an exciting evening of knowledge, information, and conversation. So I'll turn it over to Heather to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Yes, this is Heather Haar. I'm with the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. I'm sorry I'm on my phone tonight. I'm just having some technical issues with my computer. But I'm really glad that everybody is here. And I want to thank our speakers for coming and the work that they've done to prepare for this presentation tonight. And I'd like to thank the audience, which is arriving, for turning out, and we're interested in the ideas that the audience has and the speakers. And, you know, talking about this brain and neurocognitive system health, well, this is part of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania's Reimagine project, where we go into communities and have people envision what kind of sustainable, economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable future do they want to see in their communities. And so then after doing reimagining, after coming up with ideas, the people work on putting them into place. The people who came up with the ideas work on that. So it's wonderful. You know, League is led by its members, and it's wonderful the job that Etta is doing as a League member in Cambria County. And so she's looking at visioning sustainable communities and a focus on health, which, you know, the sustainability doesn't actually usually focus that much on health. It's more about like solar panels or something. But we've learned both in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and through our groups of, you know, regular citizens telling us what they'd like to see in their communities. We can see that the health is extremely important, and brain and neurocognitive health is something that, you know, society is just having the technology to do. So we look forward on building this out. And now I'm going to turn this over to Mark to make some remarks about what you'll be doing this evening from a technical standpoint. And then Mark will come back to me to announce the first speaker.
Thank you, Heather. Yep, my name is Mark Dixon, and I'm just managing the tech portion of this event, and so glad to be doing it. Also have a fascination with the content and the topics as well, personally and professionally. I want to let everybody know that we're recording this event, And so please know that to the extent that you're visible, you may be recorded, or if you speak up, you will be recorded. And we're also transcribing this event using Zoom's built-in transcription feature. So you can watch a transcript unfold in real time during the event. And there are controls in your Zoom console, either ... or CC button that will lead you to the transcript feature. Our presenters will present for between 10 and 15 minutes, and I'll be kind of keeping them on target best we can. And then to the extent that you have questions, we encourage you to save up your questions until after all three speakers have presented. But if you'd like to enter them in the chat while they speak, just as a place to deposit your question for being addressed after they speak, then please do feel free to drop your questions in the chat. It'd be best, though, if you didn't embark on detailed or multiple back and forth conversations in the chat, just so that we can keep the group's attention on the speaker. And then after all three speakers have presented, we'll move into the Q&A portion of the event, and then into breakout rooms. So we'll be able to have a sort of a group Q&A, but then you'll also be able to do some reflection and connect with one of the three speakers in the breakouts after that. Feel free to note, if you like, that you may be speaking on your own and not as a representative of a company or organization. If that is indeed the case, just feel free to designate that if that's necessary. And also know that if you send a chat message to someone privately in Zoom, know that I will be able to see that chat as the host and facilitator of the event, and it will be recorded. And so please know that it's a private chat that's not entirely private. And then if you have any tech issues during the event, feel free to let me know via direct chat in Zoom, or you can text me directly or call me outside of Zoom, and I'm going to put my phone number in the chat there, 415-672-5537. And that's all the technical information that I have for you. Please, Heather, take it from here.
Yes. So Professor Nancy Michaels is the Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Neuroscience and Behavior major in the College of Science at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Michael received her BS degree in biomedical science from Western Michigan University in 2001. After spending many years in the workforce, she returned to graduate study in 2008 and earned a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Minnesota in 2012. Professor Michael uses her disciplinary expertise to develop and implement NEAR, which is an acronym that means neuroscience, epigenetics, adverse childhood experiences, and resilience. So it's a science approach that aims to mitigate the impact of toxic stress on individuals and communities. Dr. Michael's research uses a community-based change theory model to work with community organizations in developing population-specific, near-based strategies to support the organizational and community efforts in becoming trauma-informed. And we felt that Dr. Michael's approach is really relevant for sustainable communities. And this is the key to sustainability is neurocognitive system health. So, Dr. Michael?
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm pleased to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I'm just going to get my screen up and ready to go, and then get some meeting controls right out of the way. There we go. All right. So welcome. Right. So my background, I'm a neuroscientist by training. I'm really excited to just be kind of sharing some of the I don't know, understanding of the field with you guys today, particularly in the context of building sustainable communities, right? With the understanding of brain and neurocognitive system health. And so they think that question that I'd like everybody to just kind of sit with at first is, what if the origins of healthy communities and community wellness actually lived inside of the brain? We often don't think culturally very much about brain health, right? We all walk around with a brain and it does all of these amazing things every day. But we do, to Edo's point in the very introduction, we think about kidney health, we think about heart health, we think about, vascular health, but we don't talk about brain health very much. And I would assert that it's critically important in understanding kind of the root causes of some of our most pressing social correlative health kinds of issues. So, how does the brain grow? This is just kind of neuroscience 101. Trying to pack my entire education in approximately 15 minutes. Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks. Oh, all right. There we go. So how does the brain grow? So this is just a graph, right? So we have male dots in blue and female dots in red. This is weight here along the y-axis and age in years along the x-axis. And you'll notice that even though it's in the metric system, right, the brain grows in weight over 3 times. It more than triples its weight in the first 5 years of life, which is just this remarkable, proliferative, and expansive growth of tiny humans. And so what's really driving this brain growth are what's called synaptic proliferation. So there are some words I'm going to be using tonight. So neurons, number one, neurons are one of the 2 main categories of cells in the brain. It's estimated that people have approximately 86 billion neurons. And the way that these neurons communicate, so there's 86 billion of them. So they're not working in isolation. They communicate through these really, really remarkable circuits. And these circuits, the way that these individual neurons form then are through these connections that your brain learns over time or forms over time. And these points of connection or communication between neurons are called synapses. So when I use the word synapses, I'm talking about those points of communication in the brain. And what is a major, major driver of this dramatic brain growth is something called synaptic proliferation or synaptic growth. So you can see here is in this panel 1, these are drawings of actual human brain tissue. This is right at birth. This is at 3 months of age. And this is at 2 years of age. And if I told you that the number of neurons, those little black triangle looking things, so this is taken from human cortex, number of neurons in each of these panels is the same. What do you think? You can put it in the chat. What do you think what's happening here? Or just what do you notice about the differences in the panels? Just a qualitative, descriptive observation. Yeah, so increased connections, making memories. Absolutely. It's this constant exchange with the environment that's driving this synaptic growth, okay? So critical to this development is a caregiving relationship. So what can babies do on their own? Put it in the chat again. What do babies do? They smile. Eventually they do, right? I remember with my first child, eye contact. Yep. They eat, sleep, eliminate. Yes. Yes. When I ask that question to younger crowds, they say they poop. Right. Yes. They eliminate, they eat, they sleep. They eventually make eye contact. Smiling. I remember with my first daughter, right? She was about 2 months old at that time of that first social smile. And it's like the most rewarding thing in the whole wide world, right? So they wave arms, they kick their legs. Absolutely. And all of those things are really dependent upon how the quality of this relationship. So this relationship not only says, so babies can't do much on their own, right? They're not able, they can cry, they can go to the bathroom, they can breathe. They can't get their own food. They can't get their own water. Temperature regulation, right? They rely on a caregiver to help them moderate their body temperature through responsive caregiver interactions. So the quality of this primary caregiver is really crucially important in being the moderator and driver. Remember those 3 panels and how each of those neurons grew lots and lots more branches. This primary caregiving relationship is a really critical moderator of how many branches grow, how many connections grow, what synapses grow, and the ways that neurons then can talk to one another as a child develops. Okay? So directing not only the synapses in cortex, but if you think about all these different sensory modalities like sight and touch and sound and taste, right? The way that this caregiver engages is also the critical moderator and kind of conduit to this multimodal sensory experience that we think of as being kind of a normal part of human growth and development. So this primary attachment relationship, we strive. So another kind of crazy thing is that the brain actually has expectations of its environment, right? Not in the way that we expect to have dinner at 6, but maybe the brain does have expectations of kind of regular patterned food intake, right? But the developing brain actually has expectations of its environment regarding sensory experience, requiring visual input, regarding particularly this attachment figure. So the developing brain, we've established that it cannot survive on its own, and it is obligated to attach to whoever is showing up the most, right? So there's a neurobiological obligation on the part of the infants to form an attachment relationship with the primary caregiver. And there's also a neurobiological predisposition or tendency for a caregiver also to provide consistent care for offspring. Okay? So ideally, we would all grow up in situations in which we have secure attachment. And in this ideal developmental circumstance, we have 2 neurotransmitters or 2 brain chemicals that are really critical and critically important in providing kind of this foundational motivator of brain activity in the developing brain. The first one is oxytocin. Only a couple people have their videos on, but for those people that do have their videos on, and for those people that don't have their videos on, we can all show a hand, either in person or digitally. How many people have heard of oxytocin before? So yeah, okay, there we go. A couple people, I love it, right? It's known as like the cuddle hormone, right? Or the love hormone in pop culture literature. Oxytocin is critical, neurobiologically released centrally. We think it really, the mechanism and actions of oxytocin underlie the feelings of things like trust, altruism, connection, community. There's another neurotransmitter that's also really important, particularly in the context of what's called reinforcement learning, or reward. And that neurochemical is called dopamine. How many people have heard of dopamine? Okay, awesome. You guys are like neuroscientists. I love it. So dopamine, again, is really critical. We talk about this one a lot in the context of drugs of abuse, because release of dopamine in a particular part of the brain is the common endpoint for all addictive substances and addictive behaviors in general. But these 2 neurotransmitters in concert, right? Parents' brains completely rewire to support the development of their children. Children's brains are completely dependent upon caregivers for the direction and quality and level to which brain connections develop, right? So oxytocin is actually from the experiential perspective, when we're engaged in social situations, oxytocin actually drives the release of dopamine. Neurobiologically then providing the foundational mechanism as to why social relationships are so powerfully important for brain health. It's one of the most powerfully reinforcing stimuli that we have as human beings. And this early relationship then provides the synaptic architecture, right? So all those brain connections that we looked at in those 3 panels, right? That's the foundations of brain architecture, the microarchitecture. So when we look at a picture like this, we could say, look, everybody's got a prefrontal cortex. Heard of prefrontal cortex? Yeah. All right, right. Everybody's got an occipital lobe. Maybe we haven't heard about that one as much, right? We can have these big recognizable structures of the brain, but the microarchitecture, that cellular neuroanatomy, is completely unique across every single human on the planet. And it's because approximately 20% of brain variability is driven by these environmental interactions that we have as individuals over the course of our lifetime. So these early relationships, if you put it in the context of brain growth, these early relationships are foundational to providing the baseline synaptic architecture upon which lifelong learning is scaffolded and built. In this way, the literature talks about the brain being a situated organ, as in the brain is situated in a much broader environment, and we have to learn and adapt to the environments, the qualities of relationships throughout our lifetime. And these early behaviors, right? So in close relationships, we see this appearance of behavioral synchrony as well as physiological synchrony, right? So with these serve and return interactions, I do something, you do something in kind. We exchange and we feel close and bonded. This is mirrored in things like heart rate, respiration, brain to brain synchrony, and endocrine synchrony as well. And so this is very common across intimate relationships, parents, romantic partners, but even with close friends, the brain synchrony is coordinated brain activity is really actually foundational for team coherence, right? So all these team building exercises that we do, we are social creatures at our core, right? Foundationally, we cannot remove that social component from a healthy brain architecture. I think all of us, perhaps, I don't know, yes, there was a pandemic the last couple of years. Yeah. All right. So most of us experienced some sort of social deprivation, right? So we all, I think, regardless of where we were before, over the last 2 years, most of us have some understanding of what that sadness or just that feels like in the absence of social connectedness. So remembering that the attachment figure is not only this kind of conduit for both oxytocin and dopaminergic signaling across brain architecture, but the attachment figures are also the conduits to all of the other sensory experience, because for the first many months, babies can't move on their own, right? They're dependent upon somebody else for their mobility. And for the first many years of life, we're also dependent upon caregivers to experience and learn about our broader sensory environment. Okay. So a question in community health and social correlates of health is often, so what happens in a brain, in a developing brain, when these expectant experiences, all of the things that a developing brain expects from the environment, what happens if those are taken away in some way? And this can be either through a lot of the conversation is around adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. This can be around the loss of a parent. This can be around issues like racism or sexism or inadequate access to equitable schooling, poor nutrition. I mean, name an issue, right? There are species expectant experiences. What happens to brains when those aren't met? Okay. So deviations from expectant experiences in one way or another activate any number of processes within the brain. So this is clearly not a picture of a brain. It is a simplified diagram of a brain, all right? But the idea here is that we have, all right, little baby, eyeballs coming in, right? So the visual input of caregiver is disrupted in some way. That's kind of abstracted here as whatever that sensory stimulus is through whatever the sensory organ. So it could be vision, touch, sight. Sight and vision, I guess, are the same. Vision, touch, taste, sound, all of those things. Based upon previous learning, then, another part of the brain called the thalamus will relay information to different parts of the brain, right? In situations in which the body perceives a threat, right? The brain's number one job is always survival. So in situations in which the body perceives a threat, this low road processing, it's very, very rapid. How many people on the call have ever been upset? How many people have ever gotten mad really fast? How many people have ever gotten mad really fast and not been able to say why? right? There's a difference in processing speed, right? And this is really what, all right, so we have an activation of what's considered the low road, right? This very, very rapid activation of endocrine, physiological, and behavioral responses. I'm really mad, right? And what happens to my heart rate? What happens to my respiration rate, right? It gets shallower and it increases. What happens to my level of tension, right? What happens when somebody's like, just calm down. Why are you so mad? I get more mad. Right. Okay. Okay. So, all right. But lower processing, very, very fast. This high road component, right? This is the bit of the information that is going up to cortex to become processed, right? But as we all just observed in our own histories, that takes a lot longer. And it's really hard to do if we're upset, if we're still in it, if we're upset. Us as grownups, it's easy to have that conversation. It's easy to take it out of context when we're not upset. But this low road processing is called general autonomic arousal. It's going to be heart rate, respiration, blood pressure kinds of processes. And these are in cases of stress or threat, this is activated beyond or outside of cortical control, right? But we have emotional, autonomic, and hormonal responses. Large drivers, neurobiologically and physiologically, are brain chemicals and endocrine factors, norepinephrine, epinephrine, commonly we talk about that one as adrenaline, and cortisol, right? And so it's the chronic presence of these guys in our brain and in our bloodstream and in our physiology that can really start to put pressure on not only central nervous system health, but also peripheral system health as well. Okay. So this leads us then to this idea of the social correlates of health. A lot of places, these are called social determinants of health, but they're correlative, not causal. And when you're thinking about community wellness and sustainable community health, it's really, really important to remember that correlation is not causation. Yes, the more chronic the stress dose is, particularly in a developing system, the more pressure is put on the system and it adapts to a new norm. It's a normal plastic process or a normal adaptive process of brain circuitry and physiology based on a chronic stimulus. But it unfortunately drives systems out of optimal balance, right? So these are some childhood experiences, these are some community environments that all end up contributing to discussions of social correlates of health. Okay, so here's just one example, right, of blood pressure, social correlates of health in the context of blood pressure. We have normal healthy fluctuations over blood pressure. So arterial pressure ranges, right, 120 over 80. We'll ask Dr. Osgood. He can confirm that much better than I as a practicing physician. But arteries then, right, are just like little muscular tubes or little balloons. They expand and contract based on the pressure inside of the system, right? But under situations of chronic stress, again, that chronic stress, chronic presence of factors, epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, other factors that are also circulated in much higher level, create the increases in pressure inside of the system. And just like any muscle, you can imagine that high blood pressure is like blood punching against the inside of an arterial wall. And so that arterial wall is going to respond by getting stronger. Well, the stronger that arterial is, right, that becomes hypertension because it loses the flexibility. We're taking away the dynamic range from a physiological system to adapt to chronic pressure in the environment. Okay. Broader, we can expand this conversation beyond that of cardiovascular disease. We can look at chronic depression. We can look at alcoholism. Things even like asthmas and cancers have a very large attributable risk to chronic stress or chronic stress dose early on in development. So there's a very large reason to be considering, what do bodies need, right? What does a cell actually expect in the context of broader community health? This is one of my favorite quotes. The most common way people give up their power is thinking they don't have any. Alice Walker is a playwright and civil rights activist, poet. It is so easy to be overwhelmed by all of this stuff, right? But particularly in the context of human health and human well-being, we all have a role to play because the foundations of brain health really arise out of the expectation that every brain has at least one other human that's mad, crazy in love with them. Every child's neurobiology is born with that expectation of at least one caregiver. And my goodness, I think we should be able to do better than one person loving every child, right? The issue is that when we miss those windows, right, we introduce the distance between the expectation and the experience induces the vulnerability of the system. But we all have the capacity to contribute to this because foundational to the expectation of every brain, no matter how old we get, is strong community relationships, strong affiliated behavior, and strong networks of support. And I think particularly when we consider reopening, right, it's not just about reopening, it's also about healing. And it's also about reconnecting and being intentional in that so that we can start to rebuild healthy nervous systems. This is totally my bias, so I hope it's okay. I'm the person that was invited in from a different state, so I apologize. This is the work that we're doing in our region right now, is using this information, what Heather mentioned as near science, neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience literature, kind of the basic sciences of those, to work across sector, to build on each other's strengths, to synergize our resources, to create communities that the community environments, right? When we talk about sustainability, it's about nutrition, it's about transportation, it's about community wellness, building community environments that offer all peoples their best shot at a healthy brain. Because after all, healthy bodies arise from healthy brain function. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michael. That was really good. Now we have someone from the local area here, from Altoona, and who attended, Dr. Carol Osgood, MD, who attended Williams College and got a BA in biochemistry, went to medical school at Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia. He did an internship at University of Kentucky and residency at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. Dr. Osgood's professional career path includes a research fellowship in microsurgery at the University of Pittsburgh, the Simonton Prize for Resident Research, Clinical Fellow, American Cancer Society Designated Research Award, and he was also active in the U.S. military, the U.S. Army, including Vietnam, and he is, I guess, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserves, a retired lieutenant colonel. So Dr. Osgood's presentation today represents his ongoing interest and dedication to neuroscience, including research, all kinds of research, and technological feats as well. He's researching neurocognitive impairment related to certain street drug use and trauma-related concussions. He'll be speaking about that in a few minutes. And he also does volunteer services for Blair County Drug and Alcohol and for the Pennsylvania Prison Society. So we're delighted to have you here, and please start your presentation.
Yes, well, thank you for a chance to participate tonight, and thanks to Dr. Nancy Michael for her wonderful introduction to basic neuroanatomy and important neuroanatomic functions. And Dr. Michael especially emphasized the neurons in our brain, the gray matter, and the synapses between neurons, which are so important for memory retention, establishing new memory learning, and of course, all the learning behaviors that go with those functions, socialization of all sorts, education throughout life, and so forth. But I'm going to talk today about the connections between all these neurons, the so-called white matter. And from a distance, our brain looks like a big white blob, but it's the myelin in our brains that makes it white. And this myelin insulates the axons, the long, thin nerve fibers that connect the neurons so they can communicate with each other by conducting tiny amounts of electricity down the lengths of these myelin insulated axons. And conduction speed in these connecting fibers is so important for normal cognitive function. And through my many decades of neurosurgery, I've become quite interested in that. We had an active trauma service at our regional Altoona General Hospital with lots of head injuries, innumerable concussions. And as the decades went by and the MRI scans improved, we realized that in folks that had had significant concussions or closed head injuries, we could often see some white matter damage, actual lesions, breakages in some of these axons and the myelin around them, usually in the frontal lobes, also in the temporal lobes. And as the years went by, MRI techniques and software that went with those different techniques, especially techniques called DTI, diffusion tensor imaging, helped us look at white matter much more closely. And we began to realize many other cognitive disorders and neurologic disorders had associated white matter changes that we could see on these fancy modern MRI scans. MS is the classic example. It's a post-Epstein-Barr encephalitis characterized by brain-wide areas of demyelination and so-called plaques. Long COVID is another example, post-viral illness. There's others. And neurosurgery itself, beginning over 30 years ago at Pitt, an early concussion screening test was developed. Initially, it was pen and pencil. And if your kid was on the soccer team or football team, then before the season, they would answer a lengthy 30 or 40-minute questionnaire with questions like, do you have seizures? Have you had concussions before? Do you get frequent headaches? Do you have migraines? And so on. And then if that student had a concussion during the sports season, they would repeat that pen and pencil test. But as the years went by, gradually there was a transition from the pen and pencil type test to a partially computerized or digitized test. And that was called the Impact Quick Test. And it's become widely adapted in sports medicine, including pro sports, pro football, hockey, and so forth. And eventually, that same company, Impact Test, has developed a strictly neurocognitive test. And as years have gone by, other similar computerized tests have evolved to evaluate CNS response times, impaired eye movements, and so forth. And the most recent iteration of these computerized tests is called the CogniView, and that was developed at the University of Rochester over the past decade with NIH funding. And it's, we believe, a superb way to evaluate folks for cognitive impairment in their last decades of life. And it's been adopted for a huge NIH study of dementia and MCI, or mild cognitive impairment. And that study is ongoing now. So we think this CogniView test is going to become the gold standard for neurocognitive evaluation. Now, looking back in neuroscience, there were earlier pen and pencil tests that I think many nurses and doctors are familiar with. The first widely used was the MoCA from Canada, Montreal Neurologic Institute, pen and pencil test. There's the Minnesota MME, mental status evaluation from the University of Minnesota. And then a widely used American test now, the SLUMS from St. Louis University, mental status evaluation, is a widely used pen and pencil test. But the CogniView, compared with the SLUMS pen and pencil test, is more repeatable and we think a little more accurate, doesn't take as much time, and is easier to use. And we're currently interested in using this test on folks being admitted to a local detox center. And our hunch is that people that use IV street drugs, especially amphetamines, have a chemical concussion, so to speak, with damage to their white matter. It's different pattern, different locations as compared to the concussion type injuries we saw before. And the same may be true for other types of street drugs, the various opioids and their congeners. And we know that the cells that lay down myelin in our brains have mu opioid receptors, which I think a lot of people have heard about. But there's also other receptors that are related to opioid function, the dynorphins, and the which are considered kappa receptors. There's delta receptors, and another group of receptors called arrestins. So it's an arena of considerable complexity, but our brains are very active metabolically. We know at rest we're using 15 to 20% of our glucose metabolism to sustain brain activity, and about the same amount of oxygen, again, at rest. And it turns out that our myelin, this very important biologic insulation, is turned over every few weeks, perhaps every 3 weeks. And these oligodendrocytes around the axons lay down the myelin in multiple layers around each axon fiber. And as the myelin breaks down, which it does normally, routinely, there's cells called microglia, which phagocytize and eliminate this breaking down myelin. So the brain is constantly active, even into our later decades of life. The CogniView test has normative data down to age 55. So it's been fairly widely used to screen folks from 55 to 95 for cognitive impairment or slowing or lower scores on these CogniView subtests. There's 3 of them, and they test for reaction times, different types of memory, and sensory registration and processing. So at present, we're obtaining normative values for younger folks, what we consider healthy controls, testing students at the local Penn State campus, and then we plan to compare their scoring tests on the cognitive view, their percentiles, with folks coming into a local detox unit. And we're pretty sure we're going to see changes. And what we hope to see is that as these folks stop using and achieve sobriety, that their cognitive view scores will improve and go back to normal. But we're not completely sure of that. And we think some of them, especially the younger ones using IV amphetamines, may have permanent or sustained white matter damage. Now, other parts of our brain, the gray matter areas, the nuclei with huge numbers of neurons and so forth, may also have related damage. But with our current techniques, scanning techniques, it's much harder to look at those gray matter areas, including the cortex and the important nuclei that Dr. Michaels described. So we're going to look just at the what we think are the white matter functions. And again, just a slight slowing in conduction speed in these important white matter tracks can cause significant cognitive limitations. And one of my very wise medical colleagues, experienced psychiatrists, like to repeat that psychiatric disease of all sorts is initially or foremost a cognitive disorder. And I've always kept that in the back of my mind. So if this cognitive view test indeed pans out, which we're pretty sure it's very valid and easily repeatable without the retest variations that some of the older pen and pencil tests had, that it can be very helpful in medicine generally, because when folks go into a medical office now, typically they get their blood pressure taken and their heart rate, maybe an EKG tracing. Someone listens to their lungs. They get an occasional chest X-ray if they're a smoker, and frequent blood tests to see if their bone marrow's making enough red and white cells, and platelets, tests for liver function, kidney function. In other words, all the different systems are reviewed, but the cognitive system itself, CNS, really is not routinely checked. And with a background in neurologic science, I think that should be the first function that's checked. So we're hoping with our little local research group to develop an even shorter, simpler computerized test using some eye tracking that might make it easy for a doctor's office to screen folks coming in for their yearly checkup and so forth, and detect some of these various disorders. And just looking at our population generally, we think about 10% of us come at birth with certain limitations. I think we're all familiar with many of these: Down syndrome, Fragile X, Williams syndrome, the hundreds of metabolic abnormalities that can affect our gray matter and white matter. But as life goes, so that's about 10% of our population. But as life goes on, probably another 10% of our population becomes impaired for different reasons. MS it would be an example. Strokes of different types, head injuries, of course, chemo brain, whole brain radiation, and so forth. So that may be another 10% of our population that's impaired. And these populations have always been difficult medically. They're the kind of folks that don't come back for a follow-up appointment. They don't take their medicines the way they're supposed to, if at all. Some of them are suspicious that they're mentally ill, that, quote, we're trying to mess with their minds, so they don't want to take the medicines. They won't go for consultations and so forth. And that remains a significant problem in medicine. They increase medical costs by going to the ER too often. Those ER visits are so expensive and often not that helpful. But nowadays, we suspect there may be an additional population or subpopulation of impaired folks related to drug use and excessive alcohol use and so forth. So we're hoping to look at that population more closely. Neuroscience is still in its infancy. There's so much about the brain we don't understand, but it's a time of great progress and change in neuroscience. And I might just mention one huge ongoing study in Great Britain. They have a national health system there, so it's a little easier for them to organize large studies, and they're going to scan 100,000 of their population, randomly selected, different ages and sexes from all over the British Isles, and then all these folks will get ultra-modern MRI studies using DTI techniques to look at their white matter tracts. And they'll also have GWAS, genome-wide surveys, to look for correlations between white matter changes and the underlying genetic substrates. They're about halfway through that. It was interrupted by COVID, but they're starting to report some of their findings already. But what we're concerned about, in addition, everyone's aware, I think, of how important genetics are in some of these things, including major groups of mental illness. But people that use street drugs, alcohol excessively may, especially earlier in life, may have some what we term epigenetic changes. Changes in the transcription factors that regulate which genes are expressed in our neurons and myelinating producing cells. And these changes may persist throughout life. We're not sure, but we know epigenetic changes may be very important in some of these disorders. So again, we're very interested in white matter functions per se, and hoping to look at this population of folks moving into detox units in a little more detail. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And we'll be in a breakout room later if there's questions.
Thank you, Dr. Osgood. That was so fascinating. and hearing about the CogniView and the different technologies being used to measure things and how that makes a difference in what we are able to attend to and treat. That's great. So thank you very much. And now, Dr. Lauren P. Jacobson is an associate professor of teaching in human development and family studies at Penn State Altoona. She serves as the program coordinator and academic internship supervisor for HDFS. She has a PhD from Penn State University in Human Development and Family Studies, 1994. Dr. Jacobson has research interests related to several areas of adolescent development, including the impact of athletic participation on biopsychosocial development, young adult transitions to college athletics, adolescent attitudes toward diversity, and most recently, examining contemplative practices, mindfulness, and human flourishing in relation to the transition to adulthood. Interests also lie in areas of pedagogical research focused on college students' experiences with collaboration, reflection, and resilience-building activities. She is also an active participant with Penn State's Students Flourishing Initiative and teaches the art and science of human flourishing each spring at Penn State Altoona. She serves on the board for Big Brothers Big Sisters of Blair and Huntingdon County, the Child Advocacy Center of Blair County, the Healthy Blair County Coalition, and the Altoona Area Public Library. She's been a youth swim coach for the Blair Regional YMCA for 25 years. Dr. Jacobson.
Thanks for inviting me to participate in this initiative. I think this is exciting. I feel like I'm coming at this from, so you got the kind of micro level look, although, I mean, definitely Dr. Michael's kind of integrating brain development and community, and I'm going to be the 30,000 foot view, I think, of how to take a step back and embed all of these ideas about the brain and human potential and human capacity in the larger context. And really, you know, my interests are in not focusing on individuals making individual decisions that are good or bad, and really broadening our understanding of how people function and adapt. And Dr. Michael talked about plasticity, and Dr. Osgood talked about drug use and all of those kind of things. How can we start thinking about how communities can help people find the best experiences for themselves moving forward? So that's kind of what I'm bringing to this. I'm in human development and family studies, and so our real interest is in individual differences and like all the different ways people aren't the same, but that people are different. So let's see. Now I've sort of thrown together like all these like different levels of things that I think matter in trying to understand community. So hopefully I'll tie it all together and it'll feel like it flows. But I was trying to capture maybe just ways that we tend to think about things and how can we broaden how we think about things to kind of really benefit our communities. Because it's really important not to think on the individual level, to really start understanding that people are not making decisions completely on their own. So when they're making good or bad decisions, they are powerfully influenced by everything around them. So when I make a good decision, I don't think, oh, that was so smart of me. I think, look at all these people who contributed to my ability to make this decision, the resources I've been able to access to make those decisions, you know. So trying to kind of doing that right from the start when children are young, and you start to see all the different ways they function, and then going across the lifespan. And I sort of laughed when Dr. Michael was showing the graph of brain growth, and I realized that next year I'm going to be 60, and that looked like 60 was the first time you see a meaningful dip in brain growth for both men and women. So I sort of feel like I'm moving in that direction. So maybe that's my tie-in with brain development here. But I'm really going to be focusing kind of on this larger context, I think, to try and explore some of this stuff. Okay, so. This little slide might seem sort of oddly placed, but I did turn that on. But I heard this story last year. I teach this class on art and science of human flourishing, and it's all about trying to understand the individual in the context and how we're all interconnected. And this story I came across about whales in the 1800s, getting at the power of community. And essentially I thought it was a fascinating story about whales whose natural inclination when they're in the ocean was to, when they were threatened, because they were usually threatened by orcas, was to gather and group and, come together in a crowd. And then whaling came along. And of course, for the whalers, that big bunch of whales all together made it really easy for them to slaughter whales. Within a couple of years, and they've been able to digitize based on reports from whaling boats. They were recent researchers were able to figure out that over the next couple of years after whaling started, these whales figured out not only that they shouldn't group together like that, but they should swim upwind. Is it upwind? Whatever way the ships wouldn't be able to capture the wind. So they would swim away. They figured out together that they should not stay together like that, and then they should swim away from the boats in a particular direction so they could figure out where the wind was and all of that. So they did this as a function of being in a community. And so it meant they had to communicate with each other. They learned from past mistakes, from the way, they were communicating with each other, picking up data, learning from that in a fairly short amount of time. Were able to figure out ways to reduce the carnage for their own population. And I think that stands as a nice metaphor for how we as small communities, larger communities, can think about our own progression. Like what information can we get together and spread around to make ourselves more successful as a community. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating. I don't want people to feel like, I'm suggesting that we should be more like the kind of the Nordic model. So if you're a little bit familiar with the Nordic model, it's much more about kind of bringing together ideas about capitalism, idea about market economies, market efficiencies, and tying that up with socialism and ideas about socialism. But it gives you a way to start looking at the way, let's see if I can move this over here, the way they think about their country, their communities, the people in them, their responsibility to the people that live there, and the responsibility of the people that live there to their larger country, right? So it is like a free market economy, but they structure their communities, their countries in a way that tries to reduce the negative impact of market forces. So, we all know if you've ever been with somebody who's got some kind of difficulty or challenge that isn't well represented in the population, it can be hard to get treatment. It can be hard to get services. There's a reason why there's a lot of drug and alcohol services out there, because it's well represented in the population, and the market forces it suggests to people that there's a way to make money off of that. But if you start to think about what can the community do to reduce people's challenges with drug and alcohol, or other kinds of problems, and I think Dr. Michael showed us, right, the graph of all the different things that are in the environment that we think are contributing, stressors, things like that, contributing to people's health challenges. This is sort of suggesting, maybe there's a way that the environment around us can be more supportive. Okay, so, I don't know, depending on how much you know about the Nordic situations, in the end, it's about spreading out risk for communities more broadly. So individuals aren't sort of constantly struggling, because again, go back to that notion of stress and the impact that has on the brain and how that affects the messaging that's going through the brain about kind of being reactive. If that's kind of your constant experience, which is kind of how we've set our country up, right? People, if people are stressed enough, if they're anxious enough, they'll work harder. That's kind of the motto, right? If you want this, you'll work hard to get it. And so that doesn't allow us to kind of appreciate how much effort it takes to deal with stress for people who are kind of marginalized. We saw that definitely in the pandemic. All those people who were working in jobs that didn't have insurance, that didn't have the luxury to work from home. The amount of stress, the amount of activation it would take to kind of work through that was probably overwhelming. And how does that reduce their ability to reach their full potential? So this notion, this Nordic model, kind of gives us some just ways to conceive of it. I'm not endorsing this as a way we should do it, but how can we maybe support people more in our communities? Because there would definitely be some challenges or barriers maybe here. Whoops, will that go? I'm going to see if I can, there we go. So let's think about community. So what am I talking about? My community of mushrooms here. When we're thinking about community, when I thought it would be helpful to kind of define what I'm talking about. When I'm thinking about community, this is something where we have things that we're sharing together. So groups are part of this. They belong to this. They are connected to each other. There's trust, mutuality, collaboration. These things are bringing us together in community. And I really see this as an active, communities are built around people actively engaged, not passive recipients of anything, right? So if the notion of kind of socialism is that people are passive, my notion of community is very, very active. People are actively involved. What happens when they get uninvolved? They're isolated, they're lonely. And so people flourishing must occur in a community, and that flourishing creates this interdependence that makes them more successful. Okay, so just a little framework for, I'm kind of building out my framework from starting at how individuals develop and kind of moving up to community health. So I come from a lifespan perspective where we really think about people as developing across the lifespan, that there's certainly periods of development where there's lots going on. Dr. Michael showed us that with the brain development, really rapid development in the early period, but they're all interconnected, and what's happening early is impacting what's happening later, and all. So we're always engaged in trying to understand people across the lifespan, and arguing that change is possible, not probable, but possible at any point. So some of the key things that I think are important are understanding that people are in a context, they must adapt to that context, Their relationships are powerful and bidirectional, that it's not a top down, like parents aren't just impacting children. If you've had a baby, that's a bidirectional relationship from the moment that child's conceived until the moment I'm not around anymore. Even when, both my kids are moved out of the house, they're still impacting me, right? That relationship's going back and forth. We need to understand people biologically, psychologically, and socially, and we can't really understand those things fully as separate entities. So the biological self is interacting with the psychological self, with the social self all the time. Historical timeframes, cultural factors are really powerful, and we can see that now. I'm assuming Dr. Michael's seen that with her students as well. That's just the impact of COVID on students' ability to cope and adjust is really affected. And so, but I also believe, right, not just brain plasticity, but human plasticity to adjust to whatever their circumstances are, which I see as a little bit broader than resilience. Resilience sort of implies that things are going, people are bouncing back from difficulties. Plasticity can be ugly sometimes. It can be, I sort of see drug and alcohol addiction as a form of someone adapting not the way we'd like, or not in a way that's good for them, to their circumstances. They're doing something to try and cope that's maybe in their head the only opportunity. And again, community can maybe come in and change that. So in my head, this is the model that I always operate on. Oops, how do I take you over here? Maybe I don't. There we go. So I'm embedding children in this setting. They have all of these things going on in their lives. Their parents have all of these things going on in their lives. Maybe the parent is a caregiver, a grandparent. You want to be able to complicate this in 100,000 different ways. And I'm embedding all of these people. So every child has all of these things going on in their own person. All of these things are interacting with their school, their social network, whatever's going on with the parent's marriage or lack of marriage, their work, right? The parent has all of this going on, and we're embedding it in community, society, cultural, the natural environment, and time. So all I'm trying to do is see. So that is like every single kid has this picture following them around. This is what they're trying to navigate. So how do we kind of help them do that? I'm going to have to keep moving us around here, aren't I? So thinking about all of this as interdependent. Again, some of this will come from our ideas about flourishing and what it takes for humans to do that. But really starting to stop thinking about people as independent. They just aren't. You aren't conceived independently. You aren't born. You're born into a context. You have to be interacting, and even if you aren't interacting, that's kind of part of the interdependence. Like if there's nobody there, right? We saw the picture Dr. Michael had of there's no caregiver for the child to see. That's an interdependent, what's there, something's there. And so the lack of that or the presence of that can be equally powerful, right? So our flourishing is us, humanity, the natural environment that we're around. John Powell talks a lot about what happens when you start. So now I'm going to shift into kind of thinking about interdependence, inclusion, and what happens when our communities start to put people into boxes. So the notion of understanding people as not different, but all similar in some way. How are we othering other people? How are we kind of pushing them aside and instead of helping them belong? So you can look him up. He's got some. And if anybody's interested, anything I put on here, I can give you the reference. I didn't create that, but I could if there's anything you want to look at later. But really, how belonging has been looked at in the literature as one of the most fundamental sources of distress, like a lack of belonging, and the powerful forces creating success. If I feel like I belong, that, and it's not just that I belong to my family, but my family feels like it belongs to the community, and the community feels like it belongs to the state or wherever, right? So the power of belonging becomes important. And then what happens when people start to feel included or excluded? And diversity is oftentimes one of those forces that we talk about, but, as noticing differences and everybody's the same. And I think you really need to think about diversity as about differences and similarities and understanding those two things in relation to each other. That if you only focus on differences, you're missing the point. If you only focus on similarities, you're missing the point. Because, in my head, everybody's different. And I always talk to students about, the interesting thing about people isn't the average, right? That in the normal distribution, the average, that high point where they find the greatest number of people. It's that bell curve at the bottom where you see the variability, and you're going to see that variability, right, within any group. I don't care whatever group you're looking at, men and women, people of different ethnic or racial backgrounds, sexual orientation, age, religion. You're going to see the most variability within a group rather than between groups, right? So there's more differences among women than between men and women, and that becomes kind of really the power of how we need to include people, how that affects community. We saw that a lot with the pandemic. We saw that when people don't think about their community in the broadest sense, not just who's like me, but everybody, people get left out, right? So a lot of the things you saw during the pandemic were resources for people who were like the politicians, but then at the same time, they were cutting things like SNAP benefits, so the people who aren't like me aren't getting included in this broad umbrella of opportunities. Heather McGee has a wonderful TED Talk where she talks about racism and how it affects everyone, right? So when you leave people out, try to leave people out, you're likely excluding yourself from opportunities. And her example that she talks about is the community swimming pools, where when they had to start integrating those and allowing African Americans into the community swimming pool, instead of allowing that, the communities drained the pool. So yes, Black people could not go swimming, but nobody could go swimming. And so she has numerous examples of how that kind of thinking, of exclusionary thinking, like thinking that some people are going to get stuff that I don't get, really diminishes the whole community, not just people of color. Nobody gets to go swimming. So how do we make adjustments? Oh, I'm talking too long. You should have cut me off. Well, I'll try to wrap it up here. So thinking about empathy, compassion as powerful tools we can start to celebrate in communities, emphasize in communities. How can we extend opportunities to as many people as possible? You can look at, there's lots of research on compassion and how when I start, if I'm compassionate, it's good for me, but it's also good for the people I'm compassionate towards, right? And we know, this might tie in a little bit to what Dr. Michael was talking about and Dr. Osgood, babies come equipped with lots of tools to be compassionate, to understand right from wrong, to understand how they connect to other people. They come equipped with the ability to be biased. We know that was somewhat of a survival strategy. And so how do communities try to diminish bias that's based around the wrong qualities and trying to get them to embrace the right and wrong and bringing everybody into the mix? So thinking about the science of community, this is something we can expand, we can spread, we can really grow communities, we can layer social networks of people. Loneliness really does. How can we reach out to as many people as possible, and recognizing that we have a tendency to segregate, not just around race. We segregate on income, we segregate on age. I mean, I tell students all the time, if you are a college student, it is very likely that the only people you're around is college students. If you are a preschool child, the only people you're around are preschoolers, right? If you're a teenager, you're only around teenagers. And for older adults, they make communities for people who are just older. And that's not really healthy or community-based. So I will try to wrap up quickly. Just the University of Wisconsin has a really nice model for thinking about population-based community health. It's sort of encouraging a shifting in how we distribute funds. And they have some great resources on looking at your own communities, but you can see here they're suggesting in terms of health care that communities should be spending something closer to 20%, and your resources should really be going for the best community health outcomes toward social and economic entities like schools and places where people can meet and gather. They have a model. You can look at their data. You can see the health factors. They've collected tons of data from across the country. This is their model. I won't go through that. In case you want, I can sort of help you think about it, but they're showing you where you can start thinking about your community to improve. And if you go on their website, they have every state, every county, and every state across the country outlined for overall health factors and what's the other one? Health outcomes. And you can you can see here's Blair, there's Cambria for mortality and morbidity. They show you the different rankings, the data they've pulled from across the country. It's interesting. You can see how your county looks relative to others, and you can look at the different health factors they look at and make those comparisons. So it's an interesting way to really conceptualize, see in what communities look like at that broad kind of county level. So I'll wrap up, not as quickly as I should have, with just, thinking about people as part of something larger and how we would all benefit if everybody felt included and could make the best decisions possible. Okay.
Thank you. That was very enjoyable. So now we're going to have a panel discussion, and we're not going to do this for very long so that we have time to also get into the breakout sessions for a little while. So we'll take questions for about 10 minutes. So if you have a question, you can, raise your hand and we'll call on you. You can raise your hand either with your actual hand or by pushing the little raise hand button at the bottom of the screen. There's like a reactions. And so if you want to put your hand up, you can use that to put your hand up. Also, you can write your question into the chat. And we do have people taking notes of that, and we're going to ask questions. So if we could have Etta and Kathy Cook, who is come from the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. She's the Environmental Policy Director, and I, to the ability that I can, will take questions and, ask questions of the speakers. So did we receive in the chat any comments or questions during these presentations?
One that's in there is, how do we advocate for community brain health?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you, Kathy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you could each take a few minutes, each speaker, and answer that question, that would be great. Let's start with Dr. Michael?
It is a great question, and I think everybody has the opportunity to do it within their own skill set, within their own network. Yeah, I mean, right. So Dr. Jackson mentioned the community is about active engagement and not passively sitting, and that kind of the Nordic model is about shared resources to reduce stress burden, right? And I think that that's a great way. That's a great way of thinking about kind of developmental expectations, right? That every person has the ability to reduce the stress burden of another person. Not only right to expectations, not only in childhood, but are across a lifespan. And that a lot of those social correlates of health that we see, it's not because there's like a bad or good plasticity. It's exactly the outcome that we would expect based on environmental exposures, right? And so if we want to see different outcomes for health and well-being, we have to be looking at what those developmental and cellular expectations are for health and well-being across a lifespan and meet those along the way, right? Because again, the plasticity is just it's a normal function of learning, and it just, yeah, I mean, it lands badly sometimes, but it's not surprising how it lands based on distance between expectations and experience. And so kind of, I mean, learn more. There's a ton of really, right, make sure you vet your sources. But Lauren, I know that a lot of really great work comes out of University of Wisconsin. The Center on the Developing Child at Harvard is another remarkable center that produces just some of the best accessible resources. And then, so, if it's interesting, learn a little bit more. And then we all have strengths, we all have networks that we can work and leverage influence in. So
Thank you. Let's see. How about Dr. Osgood?
Yes.
Maybe you want to, Kathy?
We're asking,
Go.
we're asking, how do we advocate for community brain health?
Well, of course, I'm interested in brain structure, and especially the white matter, which is about 2/3 or 3/4 of our brain weight content. And we know white matter also is important in learning and plasticity. If you learn to play a musical instrument, learn certain athletic activities, your white matter tracts in certain areas get larger, show more myelination, and so forth. And referring to that British study, they're starting to go through their fancy MRI scans, and they've identified 180 white matter tracts. A given tract is a recognizable course of white matter that's 2.5 millimeters or thicker. And then stepping back a bit and looking at those tracts, they think they've identified 100 different types of tracts that they can fit into different subpatterns. And just like we have loops and whorls in our fingerprints, they think we have similar white matter patterns when looking at very detailed pictures of our brains. So we think white matter integrity is so important for good conduction speeds and good cognitive functions. And medically, at a very basic level, if you get really out of shape and overweight, your white matter doesn't look quite as good, and your cognitive test functions drop a bit. So then you might ask, well, how much of our population is overweight and out of shape? Well, you don't want to know the answer to that one. So again, good physical health is and some type of decent conditioning is so important for our white matter function. and various things that interfere with our white matter function, of course, can affect our cognitive functions and our social abilities and relationships in so many ways. So that's what we're interested in. And nationwide, there's a huge amount of interest, all sorts of research groups looking more closely at these things.
Thank you. Yes. So, Dr. Jacobson.
Yeah, I just think if we start thinking that individuals aren't just accountable to themselves, so I'm not just accountable to myself, but that I'm part of something bigger than myself, and I make decisions, which means other people make decisions in these complex environments, like that is going to be your first step. That I want not just my kids to do well in school, but everybody's, like my kids will do better in school if the other kids around them are also doing better. So I pay my taxes. I try to create programs where people are going out in the community, just really appreciating the, sidewalks, just the things that create a sense of community, make people feel safe, make people feel trusting, and help people kind of engage with the people around them. So it's kind of a shift in your thinking. Like your worldview needs to shift from thinking that I just got to figure out how to get through this to I got to figure this out along with all these other people. And if we all do it together, we're all going to be better off. That's not a step, but.
Great. Let's see. So do we have some other questions? Is there anybody in the audience?
There is a question in the chat. Would you like me to read it? Is that, or Etta, do you want to read it?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, Karen is asking, I worry about children receiving head impacts in sports, especially youth sports where the brain is still developing. What can we do to encourage doctors to support encouraging parents to stay away from contact sports at a young age?
Well, that's a good question. And a century ago, we had intercollegiate boxing, which was popular for a while, but in the early 20s, there were several fatalities. And of course, this was way before CAT scans and MRI scans and whatnot, but intercollegiate boxing was eventually banned. Now, will some of our other contact sports eventually go that same route, football being an obvious example? I don't think too many neurosurgical groups would be in favor of contact sports like that. However, there's another aspect of sports, and that's teamwork, cooperation, learning group skills, and so forth, and learning the importance of fitness early in life. I think that's important. So we don't want to be too negative towards sports. I think they're a healthy part of youth development and education in different ways. But the cumulative effects of concussions can be very serious. We've got numerous examples, pro football players that have had too many concussions, boxers, Muhammad Ali, and so forth. So those types of sports do cause cumulative white matter damage. And again, neurosurgery groups are not going to encourage violent sports like that. Although it seems that the highest incidence or rate of concussions are in women's soccer. So I'll not digress further.
Nancy, did you want to address that? I mean, all I was going to say is if you're sort of thinking about doctors and parents, I think the issue is bigger than that. So as a country, we celebrate impact sports, and this is if you talk to parents, they see this as their kids' ticket to college, which is almost never the case, but this is how, and it doesn't, I mean, you're thinking about brain development. I see it in swimming, just pushing an 8-year-old in a way, you got to go practice every day, and that parents aren't doing that themselves, like having expected, like turning sports into a job, right? So as long as parents are in an environment where what we celebrate about kids is their ability to be athletically successful, it's going to be very hard, especially when you get into lower income neighborhoods where they might see this as their only option for, having success in the sense of the way we think of success. It's going to be really hard for doctors to push, like, doesn't matter what doctors say, parents are going to say, well, this is my kid's chance. So I think it has to be like a cultural adjustment in how we think about what makes what's important for kids to get out of it. So, shut up.
No, the only thing that I would add, I work at a Catholic university, and so there's all this like think globally, act locally, which I think is like spot on to both what Dr. Jacobson and Dr. Osgood were saying, like super important to be out in your environment and moving around and learning how to take care of your body and doing all these things. So very locally, there are other alternatives to contact sports. But the sport itself, anyway, the sport itself is not that, right? Just use your body, right? But to Dr. Jacobson's sport, right, that also be aware within those conversations that the issue is much, much bigger than a conversation between a parent and a child or a doctor and a child. That there are mammoth cultural forces that really, really encourage a lot of things that aren't good for brain health, right? And so, yeah.
Yeah,
Both are important.
Yeah.
Oh,
Some of those sports have a strong cultural component with a huge element of machismo. And so that's, again, I think, affecting a lot of young people and the types of sports they play and how hard they train and fight and so forth. But that machismo concept also, I think, has a lot of other social effects. Being able to work long hours and so forth. Remember, 50, 60 years ago, the working hours for residents in medicine were crazy. I mean, major sleep deprivations and so forth, almost maximal stress, which we realize now is counterproductive in a lot of ways, and that rest and especially normal sleep patterns are so important for cognitive functions and the socialization abilities and whatnot that go with that. But these are things that will probably change very slowly.
Yes. So thank you. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the breakout rooms now. So Mark will have some instructions on that for you. And those of you who didn't get to ask your question in this Q&A session right now, you can take your question into the breakout room and ask it. So, and Mark will also be sending a link so that you can you can answer the question, what can we do to address this problem in our communities, to create neurocognitive health in our communities.
Super. Yep. So I'm about to open up the breakout rooms, and the speakers will be automatically deposited into their room, and then everybody else will get a chance to choose which room they'd like to jump into. Room one will have Dr. Nancy Michael. Room 2, Dr. Carol Osgood. Room 3, Dr. Lauren Jacobson. And so you can go into that room and have a dialogue with them. And we will be in there for probably about 10, maybe a little more than 10 minutes. And then we'll come back and then you can share briefly your reflections and parts of the dialogue. But primarily the core question that we'd like you to reflect on and to also jot some notes down on as you move into breakouts is the one that I put up on the screen now. How can we integrate understanding of the neuroscience of brain and cognitive system health to improve community and public health? To improve community and public health. And then we've created a Google Doc that is available at the link that you can see here. Reimagine Cambria Blair, bit.ly/Reimagine Cambria Blair. And I think, is that, would you like me to auto-assign and not self-assign?
Probably be better, Mark.
Okay, so I'll just auto-assign. Give me just a second. Great. Okay, I'm going to send you all to your rooms. Have a conversation. We'll see you back in a few minutes. Thanks.
We're going to have someone from each room just summarize briefly, just say what the group talked about. So from Dr. Michael's room, if Lori or Caroline would like to speak.
I can say something. I'm sitting in I'm sitting in the dark, so I'm not going to turn on my camera, but we had a lovely conversation about just how much this information of I brought up sleep because I think sleep is so important, and regulating our emotions, naming our emotions needs to occur so much earlier. It needs to occur, period, and needs to occur early and ongoing with young children and with families and in communities, because it has everything to do with our behavior and has everything to do with our connection. Basically, that's what we talked about, correct? Anyone else?
That's an excellent summary. So let's go to Dr. Osgood's group.
Okay, that I was taking notes for that. And we discussed the need for education, the public awareness of brain damage from drugs and alcohol, the positive role models that we need from our community groups and from our family and friends. We discussed the pandemic and the emphasis on interdependence, and we hope that people learn from the pandemic that we do need each other. We talked about the need for drug rehabilitation programs, talked about more cognitive development tests, the idea of learning for life, the need for compassion, and the importance of physical health and exercise.
So those are a lot of different related topics. Thanks, Kathy. How about Dr. Jacobson's group?
How's that?
Great.
Okay. Well, basically, my question, coming from an early childhood perspective, I think that those years are so important. I think they're so undervalued in our society. I worry that when we have a national early childhood program that I know is part of what the president wants to do, and I love the idea, but it's got to be quality. There has to be room for social, emotional development as well as all the other areas of development. It's got to be based on good philosophy that's implemented throughout the day, or it's wasting a whole lot of precious time. And it shouldn't stop there. Really needs to be part of elementary school too. I mean, we're emotional creatures. It's complicated part of us, and I don't know. I think that we all feel like it deserves to be supported throughout our development. So that's what we've basically talked about preschool.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
So we thank everybody for coming to this program tonight. I'd like to give a few minutes for Etta Albright to talk about her impressions and what the next steps are. And we hope to continue the people of Cambria and Blair counties and elsewhere via Zoom to continue the engagement of people on topics and issues that make a big difference for the sustainability of our communities. So, and maybe we'll have an in-person event sometime over the summer where people who've been at one of these get to meet each other in person. Okay, so Etta?
I can't thank the presenters enough, Dr. Osgood, Dr. Jacobson, Dr. Michael, for extending yourself in such a vast topic and kind of going into the unknown with us as far as the audience response and how to connect a subject that is not discussed, but yet needs to be discussed. Dr. Osgood, you gave us a wealth of information on the scientific, concrete end of research that people always look for data, prove it to me. And so that's the aspect of this program, to explore these different aspects of the subject, to find out what do we need to approach this unmet need in our communities for brain and neurocognitive health. And I think one of the most important statements that was said tonight was, hey, this doesn't just start or stop at any one point in life. It continues throughout life. And so we need to be thinking, about this impact, of brain and neurocognitive health and what's going on around about us environmentally and physically, spiritually, emotionally, and start to question these things. And there was tremendous resources given on the slides to give us matrix to go to formulate plans. So you've created a wealth of tools here, and we'll have to struggle to learn how to use them with other people in our communities. But thank you so much for making yourselves available to us in this production. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks again also to all our speakers. I want to thank you personally. Mark?
Yes, great. I'll thank everybody as well. It was a pleasure to meet you, a pleasure to work with you, and wonderful to see everybody on the Zoom event. I have a couple of remaining slides and just want to highlight the event title and then also presented by the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania Citizen Education Fund. And the event will be turned into a little video that will be up on YouTube sometime soon. And so at that point, you can share it with colleagues and friends and community members. And that is all that I have for you. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
Have a wonderful night and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.